Hey guys, I'm Tammy and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to take you behind the scenes on how I created a cohesive pattern collection for my new book, So Simple. It's this one right here. You might have seen it already, but it recently launched online and I went ahead and created 15 sewing patterns specifically for this book. They're all really beginner friendly and I want to take you behind the scenes on how I got to this point and all the processes that happen behind the scenes so you can see exactly what went into the book. So let me start off with a little bit about me. If you don't know me, I'm Tammy from Tammy Handmade and I started sewing about 6 years ago. When I first started sewing, there really wasn't many patterns that I really felt reflected my style. Everything honestly felt quite old-fashioned, and the books that I specifically bought as a beginner, they just didn't really cater to what I personally wanted to sew. So I ended up just diving straight in and learning how to draft my own sewing patterns and making clothes that really reflected the type of garments that I wanted to wear. It's definitely a process that took a lot of trial and error and a lot of experimentation on making clothes that I personally not only wanted to wear, but reflected the garments that I would find in my favourite high street shops. You might have heard of some of my best-selling sewing patterns, and that is the Naya t-shirt, the Rhea dress, the Leona dress, and also recently the Margot pinafore. So when I had the opportunity to write my first book, I knew this was going to be the perfect project for me and allow me to create something that I wish I had when I first started my sewing journey. This truly was such a labor of love and I can't wait to take you behind the scenes and really show you what the process looks like when you first start making a book, let alone 15 sewing patterns to go inside it. Where the idea for this book started. So I actually really remember the first sewing books that I personally bought. When I started, there wasn't many patterns out there that reflected my style, so I went straight to buying books and learning things like key seam finishes and all that jazz and hoped the patterns inside it would be things I wanted to sew, and there were just so many I didn't like. Honestly, the patterns inside them just never matched the style of things that I wanted to sew, and actually a lot of them I felt were very office wear driven, and obviously at that time I didn't want to sew office clothing. I wanted to sew dresses and fun things that reflected the style of clothing that I actually wore. So naturally everything I was making, I never actually wore them because they didn't fit in my wardrobe. So when I started brainstorming for what I wanted this book to be, I knew it had to be really beginner friendly, allow people to sew clothes I actually wanted to wear, and also not just be aimed at complete beginners, like have patterns inside the book that anyone of any skill level would want to sew. So that really helped me narrow down exactly what I wanted this book to be and pinpoint the key things I wanted to include inside the book. It was really my aim at the start of this journey to make a book that I wish I had when I first started out, but also provide enough patterns in the book so anyone from any skill level would actually enjoy sewing these pieces, and it wasn't just purely aimed at beginners. Planning the pattern collection. So my background's actually in graphic design. That's what I went to university for and actually studied. So naturally, when I started the process of working on this book, the first thing I did was create mood boards of the exact vibe I wanted the patterns to have in this collection. I knew if I wanted to make a beginner friendly book, and also the validation I had from my other patterns that went really well, I found that people really enjoyed having a slip-on style element to the patterns that we're creating. So there was no tricky fastenings included, and also to make sure that everything was really easy to follow and the construction techniques would also be simple to use. But little things like that, just narrowing down those key aspects I wanted all the garments to incorporate, helped me pinpoint exactly what I needed to make sure each garment actually had. Some of my best-selling patterns on my website can be sewn in a matter of hours, and I really wanted to incorporate that into some of the patterns in this book, so you didn't have to spend days and days sewing a single item. I wanted some of the projects to be purposefully very quick wins and easy makes, so you could sew something in literally a matter of hours. And this whole process of just reflecting on the garments I wanted to include in this book really brought me back to my first couple of garments I started making and I enjoyed as a beginner, and I specifically remember following a sheer dress tutorial on YouTube literally in the first year or so in my journey, and I absolutely loved making it. I actually think it was a sheer top, not a sheer dress, and I remember thinking that was the first garment that I made and I actually wore a lot of in my everyday. So I knew I wanted to include something that had like a sheer dress or a sheer top in the book because I feel like it was a good quick win project. Shearing can be a really great way for beginners to sew a piece of clothing on themselves, and the fit is really forgiving because it's obviously elasticated. So I put that one straight on on the list. I knew I wanted to have that one. And then I also kind of reflected on the fact that a lot of my best-selling patterns were dresses. So I needed to make sure within the book there were a good amount of dresses included. So we have a cami dress, a halter neck dress, a trendy cutout dress, and then also a button front dress as well. I then went on to mood board the different accessories and other garments I wanted to include inside the book, and I specifically wanted everything to mix and match together. So for example, you could wear this top and this trouser together, or you could wear this top and this skirt together, and it would all work really nicely to create a handmade wardrobe that you could feel really proud of. So I landed on including a tie front top because I wanted something that would be adjustable, where you literally just tie a bow at the front of the top and it's really easy to sew and adjust for your size. I then decided I wanted to include a knit tank top because I wanted a staple piece that you could wear in your wardrobe and literally will go with everything. The sheer dress and the sheer top, the halter neck dress and the halter neck top, the camisole top and also a camisole dress, a woven top with a button back closure because again I wanted to sew something that had like no tricky fastenings, and again sewing buttons is a lot more beginner friendly than having to put a zip in. And then for the bottoms I landed on a stretch midi skirt, a woven maxi skirt and drawstring trousers with shorts. I also wanted to include some layering pieces, so I ended up drafting a beach cover up that you can sew in a longer or shorter style, and then accessories like scrunchies and tote bags as well if you are a complete beginner and you didn't actually want to sew clothing as your first couple of projects. I just wanted to make sure that all the patterns that I was giving would work really well together, but also give someone enough patterns to really get stuck into sewing and create a whole wardrobe with just one book. It was also super important to me to include a nice mix of woven and stretch patterns because I know woven patterns can be really beginner friendly and they're probably the most preferred projects to start with because woven fabrics press really well and they're much easier to handle. But I also wanted to include a nice range of knit patterns within the book because I personally find that a lot of the clothing I wear in my everyday is stretchy, and I wanted to provide easy beginner friendly patterns for people to start learning how to sew with stretch fabric and actually make patterns they will wear every single day. I think it's really important when you're planning a collection of patterns or even your first sewing pattern, if that's something you want to get into, it's important to consider what's on brand for you. So I know my best sellers are predominantly dresses and they're really easy beginner friendly patterns, so I need to make sure I incorporated that within the book. I think it's also important to take into account how people are actually going to wear the patterns as a collection. So if they're going to wear this specific top with this specific trouser, when they're worn in the same outfit, do you want to suddenly then make the top cropped if the trousers are high-waisted? All these details can really help make sure that when people are wearing the patterns as a set, they feel cohesive and also they're able to mix and match and create a whole wardrobe of different outfits. I also did want to include like a wild card pattern, and even though this book is obviously aimed more towards beginners and intermediate sewists, I did include the button front dress as the last pattern in this book, and this is definitely an advanced sewing pattern, but I thought it'd be fun as you work your way through the book, you can land on something a lot more advanced at the end and test your skills to create something really fun. The pattern design process. So as you can imagine, this was a huge whirlwind of a project. I started working on this over a year ago, so I had so many patterns to create for this book. There's 15 patterns included, but there's 5 variations, so it in total makes 20 different garments. So let me break down behind the scenes how I got to this point. The first step of any pattern design process is going ahead to create sketches of what you want each garment to look like. So I went ahead and sketched out each garment, and then also went ahead to research what construction methods I'll probably need to know to create those patterns. I made a crazy amount of toiles to test and iterate on these patterns, and I've got a load next to me which I'm going to show you as well. But because I've already made my own sewing patterns, I know how they fit my audience. It was much easier to work with because I already had blocks I could use and manipulate digitally using Adobe Illustrator. That's a software you can use to make sewing patterns and graphic design. But ultimately I just kept iterating and playing with the pattern until I got the fit right. Normally when I make sewing patterns for myself, so when I released the Margot Pinafore pattern, I think I had around 7 rounds of amends until I got the perfect one. So you can imagine how much work goes into creating 15 sewing patterns. But let me take you through some of the samples I have right here. So one of the first ones that I created, I actually had this one sewn for me by a seamstress because as you can imagine, there was just so much sewing to do as well as actually doing the pattern creation. creation. And this was probably the third sample that we had sewn, and it's the tie front top. You can see the bottom, that's where the ties at the front tie together to create it. This is what it looks like on the model, the final garment that we created. I also wore it on myself, but she was actually a size 10 I think on the top, and I'm a size 8, so it naturally just looked a bit bigger on the bust. But from this test, I knew I really liked the lining of having a fully lined top all the way around, and then we wanted to incorporate things like elasticated arms at the sleeve, and then also just make sure that everything was really neatly finished on the inside as well as the outside. I remember this one being a bit too short, so we specifically extended the length of the top to make sure it really covered over the bust, and when you're wearing it and moving your arms up and down, it wouldn't ride up. But this is definitely one of my favorite sewing patterns, and I've worn this already on holiday, and it was really perfect for that really nice casual going out top. So the next sample that we worked on was this one right here. This one's actually really big. This is the button back top. And this one I specifically remember the front, the neckline kept gaping and the back as well kept gaping. So we went ahead and kept iterating this until it was perfect. So I think that was maybe the second sample. And then this is the last sample that I sewed, and this one fits me so well. This one was really good. This is the front of the top, and the back looks like that. So you can see we've got the button back fastening, and if I turn it inside out, you can see just how neat the insides look. We've got a facing at the back to do the button back fastening, and then also the facing goes all the way around to the front, and there's also side bust darts on the side of the top as well. So all those kind of small adjustments that you make really help narrow down if the fit is working in different areas, and that I remember being so happy when that finally fit perfectly. And then even simple projects like this tote bag, I really wanted to include a beginner friendly tote bag within the book that wasn't just like your standard one that you see anywhere. So I basically created this pattern where it has the straps that go over the front to create a really fun striking detail, and then the back looks like that. So basically a strap that's sandwiched in between the bottom seam, and I just thought it's so cute and trendy. I think this might have been the third sample because I kept playing with how big I wanted the straps to be, and I landed on this one being absolutely perfect. And then I forgot, actually I have scrunchies in here that I sewed for the final book, because again, scrunchie is such a great project if you're a complete beginner that wants to learn how to sew but doesn't have that much fabric on hand. The sheared dress is one I absolutely love making. I've made so many sheared projects in the past, but I specifically wanted a really nice one for this book. So this is actually one of the toiles that I created, and this is one I was actually really happy with. I actually ended up making the straps longer on the tie shoulder just because I wanted it to drape more down the shoulder. I do have one that I made in yellow for the final book. That one's in the wash because I wear that a lot as well. But you can see we've got a sheared bodice at the front like that, and then it goes all the way down to a nice skirt and also a ruffled bottom at the bottom. But as you can imagine, I spent so long testing and sewing samples until the fit was right on all the patterns, and I even had seamstresses to help me sew the samples to make sure everything was looking good. But it also wasn't just how the fit of the pattern was looking, it was also about how the construction techniques were sewing, were the instructions I were providing easy to follow, but also how the pattern was wearing. So I actually wore a lot of these patterns in my home for like a couple of months to make sure as I was wearing them they felt comfortable, and when they went through the wash they also were holding up. So this was a process that really did take a long time. Even just looking at the collection as a whole and making sure key finishes were the same. So on a few of the patterns we have waistbands, so I wanted to make sure the waistband construction technique would be the same across all of them. So if you're a beginner and you've learned how to sew a waistband on one of them, you then know how to sew it on the rest of the patterns that also include that. So there were definitely quite a few visually cohesive elements that run throughout the patterns. One of my favorite patterns in the book is this one right here. I actually made this not that long ago. It's the camisole dress. So this comes in a camisole top and a dress, and this one goes all the way down to like a midi length. Part of this book was actually creating patterns that I absolutely have wanted to make for a while. Like I've always loved the look of a camisole dress, but I found to get the perfect shape was really difficult. So I specifically didn't want it to look like you're just wearing a tent dress. So I specifically got bust darts created at the sides. So it just gives a bit more shape around the bust, and then it flares out at the waist and hips to create a really lovely silhouette. There's honestly just so many patterns in here that I absolutely love, and I'm so happy I've been able to finally visualize them and put them all together in one book. Once all the patterns were nailed down and they were all fitting well, it now came to the part of grading the patterns to my extended size range. It's so important to me to actually create size inclusive sewing patterns, and I wanted to make sure they reflect the patterns I already have on my website. So all the patterns are graded from sizes 6 to 32. Especially in a beginner friendly book, I wanted to make sure this might be someone's, first point of call learning how to sew and opening this book. So I wanted to make sure they felt included in the size range. So I use the same size chart and grade rule that I already implement on my other sewing patterns. So if you've ever sewn one of my patterns before on my website, you'll know that you'll fit in the exact same size or super similar when you sew these patterns. Pattern testing and feedback. So now at this stage, all the patterns had been graded, and it was the fun part of reaching out to testers that had already previously sewn garments and toiles for other patterns that I have. And I basically reached out to them and were like, hey, I loved working with you in the past. Would you mind testing some of the patterns in my book? I can't thank enough everyone that was involved in testing some of these patterns. Honestly, it's actually so incredible to see your designs come to life and see a whole range of body sew patterns that you've created, and also just giving really valuable feedback on what they wish would be included, and also just fit adjustments to make sure it fits everyone really well. So I already had a big database of people that I've already worked with in the past. So when those specific people were like, yes, please send over the pattern, and they sewed it, sometimes within a couple of days or even one day. I remember one girl, she would sew all the patterns within a day and give her feedback. I was like, wow, you're amazing. I just basically followed the exact same process I do with other pattern tests I do in the past. So all my pattern testers are paid for their time and also the materials. Now, because of the sheer amount of patterns that had to be tested, so there were 15 patterns in the end, I ended up drip feeding how many patterns we're testing at once, because otherwise it would have overwhelmed the testing group. Now, not everyone sewed every single pattern. That would have been a crazy amount of work. So what I ended up doing is splitting, like you four will sew this one, you four will sew this one, maybe a couple of people will sew at least 6 of them. And it just made sure there was a really wide range of testers that sewed each pattern. And as you can imagine, this process went on for months, like literally pattern testing, months and months went by where we just had to make sure each pattern was being tested by a good group of people. And honestly, everyone's feedback was literally incredible. It was so good just to have feedback on they actually loved the pattern, they loved the fit, the small pattern adjustments that we had to make sure it fit a range of bodies, but also the fact they love how easy to sew the pattern was, and the construction methods were really clearly explained in the instructions. Normally when it comes to patterns, I always release tester images as part of the launch, but because we had so many testers create these patterns, and a lot of the testers were actually sewing purely for fit purposes, so they weren't sewing final garments in really gorgeous fabric and taking nice photos. A lot of them were actually just taking pictures of them like sewing the top in their underwear, so obviously I can't show pictures like that. So normally I actually use my mum for pattern testing as well. She's a size 18 to 20 UK size. She was literally a guinea pig. I was just sewing so many samples in my size and also in her size, and making sure that the proportions of the garment were the same prior to actually sending the tester files out to the wide range of audience. So I already knew from the get-go that it should fit pretty much good with only a few adjustments that need to be made. But honestly, just the process of seeing people test sew your patterns is just such an incredible experience, because you finally get to see it in a wide range of bodies. Having people that had been along my journey, when I first started releasing my sewing patterns, to then test sewing patterns in my book, they were just like, this is incredible. Final pattern touches. Once I gathered everyone's tester feedback, I then went ahead and implemented the feedback that they had, and ended up not only creating adjustments to the fit of the patterns, but also changing some of the construction methods, or just making sure the wording that I use for each construction method was really easy and clear to follow. When it comes to testing your sewing patterns, it's not just about the fit of the garment. That's only one part of it. A big part of it is also people testing the instructions and all that jazz to make sure that not only is it easy to follow, but the construction method you're using makes sense for that step, and it's also just a fun, enjoyable make to sew. So now I had that all nailed down, I then had to just refine all the illustrations I created for each pattern. One of my pet peeves when it comes to sewing books, and especially ones that I first bought in the beginning of my sewing journey, was that a lot of the books I had never illustrated each step. They would have maybe written instructions for all of the steps, but only illustrate 1 or 2 key pieces. And I found that always really hard to follow. I'm someone that's definitely a visual learner, so I wanted to make sure the patterns in my book, each step was really clearly written, but also each step had an illustration to go with it. So there's like no guesswork. If you've never sewn before, you know exactly what to do. I think in a nutshell, I just wanted to make sure that the patterns I created for this book have the same level and care and attention to detail that I always do with my patterns, and just making sure that run across the entire patterns included in this book. After all that work, then came the part of actually calculating the yardage, so the amount of fabric you need to make the patterns, making sure and double checking the finished garment measurements were all correct, and then also just making sure that the pattern files are working as intended. I actually gave my pattern testers all the files just so they could test as well on their end to making sure the layers were correct, but the patterns in this book come in A4 US letter and A0 files, and the patterns are layered, so you can basically choose what size you want to sew. So I needed to make sure that all the sizes corresponded to the right layer and all that sort of stuff, because when you're looking at the same pattern over and over again, it can be really hard to make sure everything is perfect. The most daunting process of this entire book was actually sewing the final garments that were going to be photographed, because obviously I felt like they had to be really perfectly sewn. So it wasn't just sewing garments that I personally had to wear on the shoot days, it was also sewing the model's clothing and making sure that fit them really well as well. Thankfully, I did have the help of some seamstresses to help me sew clothes, because otherwise it would have been way too much work for me to do. I could talk on forever about how the process went on, because it's not just sewing the final garments, it's also planning the fabrics you want to use for each model, making sure that the outfits that they're going to wear, the fabrics you use on the top and the bottom go together, even just making sure if you want to have matching outfits for two people to wear in the same picture, making sure the fabrics you use complement each other. It's definitely not a job for the faint-hearted, because it is really hard to basically curate how the book is going to look with the fabrics and patterns you've created. Even really big things like planning what model is going to wear what outfit in your book, and then also casting and hiring models that reflect the brand that you're creating for and also the values you stand for. So I didn't only just want to have one type of person reflecting this book, I also wanted to have plus size models to also reflect the wide range of bodies these patterns work on. But it was a really fun process to really watch my vision come to life. Now, one thing I haven't really touched that much on, which is a whole honestly content and video of itself, but alongside the whole process of making the sewing patterns, I also had to plan and physically write the contents of the book. So like a recipe book, like a cookbook, it's not just the recipes inside it, you're also writing all the content that goes in the beginning of the book. So for example, I have all this content about how to sew, what seam finishes to use, all these different guidance on how to add pockets and French seams and sewing different seam finishes, and also things to assess when things go wrong, how to do basic pattern adjustments. All that stuff I also had to write and physically include within this book, which I'm really glad I did and took the time to do, because it becomes such a great all-rounder for anyone wanting to learn, but also as a great resource if you're ever stuck in certain parts of your sewing journey. You can come back this book and learn how to sew really key seam finishes and also make adjustments to pattern to grade it to your size and all that jazz. I actually found I really loved going to a cafe and writing a lot of this book. I found because I was making sewing patterns in my sewing studio home office here, I wanted to go out of my routine when I was physically writing the inside pages, because I found it like a really fun therapeutic process. Writing this book was honestly such a fun process, and it not only allowed me to really pinpoint how I recommend anyone to start their journey, but also reflect on my own sewing journey and everything I wish I knew at the beginning. Photo shoot time. At this stage, the entire book had been written, everything had been proofread, the patterns had been created, and the final garments for the models had all been sewn. So this was the really fun stage of just seeing everything I worked so hard on come together in a couple of days. So having models that I personally picked and seeing my garments shine on them was such a dream come true, and honestly this was the best part of the entire process. So here's some behind the scenes content that I actually took on the day. The photo shoot was actually 3 or 4 days long, so it wasn't just one single day. I was just there with my camera and my tripod literally trying to capture everything because it was such a fun process. This really was the cherry on the top, because I feel like this is the moment everything just came together. The models absolutely loved what they were wearing and they genuinely were so excited for what this book represents. We had an amazing photographer that literally just worked perfectly, and the entire team behind the scenes making sure the photo shoot ran really well, and it was just such a memorable and fun moment to remember. The final book. When I finally got to hold this book in my hands for the first time, I was literally shaking. I remember recording a Instagram video showing me opening it up for the first time. Honestly, seeing everything you worked so hard on come to fruition in one single book is a feeling I'll never forget. I haven't even touched on the entire process that went on behind the scenes of designing the book. So making sure the front cover and the back cover reflected my brand, and all the inside pages, making sure the book actually reflected what I wanted the style to look like. That was a whole task on its own. Even just the process of proofreading this book, so making sure people have read the entire book and making sure everything sounded right and nothing was missing. That was such a massive process of creating a book, and having known all the work that went into this and having it finally here is just something I'm incredibly proud of. If I just give you a flick through of inside the book, you can see all the patterns and also a lot of the pages inside. Something I was really proud of is how cute the inside pages look for the actual main pattern pages. So we have like a big spread of image of what the pattern looks like, and then the inside page also has information of the pattern and the size chart. And then on this one, for example, you've got your finished garment measurements and the elastic you need to cut out, as well as the yardage. And then on each pattern, like I said, each step has a illustration to go with it, as well as written instructions, and that's basically the process throughout all the pattern pages. I went into this process thinking, you know, it's going to be hard to write a book, but it can't be that hard. Oh my god, I was so wrong. I had no idea the sheer amount of work that goes into not just creating and writing a sewing book, but like including 15 sewing patterns within that book. It is a crazy amount of work, but honestly, I hope you guys enjoy this book and the patterns inside it as much as I do. I've never spent so many hours working on one single project so solidly, but the result is a book that I think is so beginner friendly, so fun to have on your shelf, and it really is the book I wished I had when I first started my sewing journey. I hope this video gave you a deeper understanding of not only what goes into creating a collection of sewing patterns, but also writing a sewing book. It's a process that I had no idea would have so many areas you have to focus on, but also work on simultaneously. It's honestly been one of the best projects I've ever worked on, and if you ever have an opportunity similar to this, I hope this video gives you a bit more in-depth detail of what the process entails, so you're definitely much more prepared than I am. If you made it this far and you want a copy of my book, it's available on Amazon and online retailers. If you just search So Simple Book or So Simple Tammy Jo How, it will pop up online. Definitely check out my website www.tammyhandmade.com if you want some beginner friendly patterns to sew. I'm also on Instagram, YouTube and TikTok, and my social handle is @tammy.handmade. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.